5 million U.S. citizens could be denied the right to vote in the November 2012 presidential election if tough new state laws that impose strict voter identification requirements go into effect. With a few exceptions, these new voter identification requirements have been enacted in states with Republican governors and Republican state legislatures. Since 2010, 11 states, Mississippi, Wisconsin, Alabama, South Carolina, Texas, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Idaho, Kansas, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania have rushed to pass voter identification laws. Certain former Confederate states, still under the supervision of the U.S. Department of Justice with respect to minority voting rights based upon a history of demonstrated racial discrimination concerning the denial of the right to vote, have been barred from implementing their voter ID laws by the U.S. DOJ by virtue of the authority of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. These voter identification requirements would almost exclusively adversely affect senior citizens, minorities, citizens living below the poverty line, and students. In order for one to make an informed judgment about the wisdom and real purpose of these recent voter identification laws enacted by certain elected officials in various states, it is necessary to view these laws through the prism of the denial of voting rights dating from the founding of our nation. The following is a brief outline of significant laws enacted to protect the voting rights of American citizens. In 1790, only white male property owners could vote. By 1850, property ownership and tax requirements were removed, which made it possible for almost all white males to vote. In the 1850s, many northern states enacted literacy tests that were targeted to block Irish Catholics who immigrated to America following the potato famine in Ireland from voting. In 1870, following the Civil War, the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to males of all races. From 1889 to 1910, all southern states enacted literacy tests and poll taxes to deny black males the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. White males were grandfathered in most states and were permitted to vote even if they paid no property tax and were illiterate. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave white women the right to vote. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act gave Native Americans the right to vote. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, eliminating Jim Crow barriers erected after the Civil War to prevent black Americans from voting. In 1995, the Motor Voter Act was passed, making it easier for U.S. citizens to register to vote. In addition to the 11 states previously listed, 21 other states, New Hampshire, Virginia, Georgia, Indiana, Florida, Hawaii, Louisiana, Michigan, South Dakota, Arizona, Ohio, Alaska, Arkansas, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, and Washington have previously passed similar laws which require a voter to verify their identity by presenting an ID each time they go to the polls. Without the proper identification, the voter will not be allowed to vote. The main difference between the laws in each state is whether or not the voter is obligated to have a photo on their form of identification. Many states have a strict law, and if the voter does not have the necessary ID, he or she will be given a provisional ballot, which means their vote will only count if the voter presents the correct ID within the time period specified by state law. If the voter fails to present proper ID, his or her vote will not be counted in the election. Elected officials who caused placement of voter ID laws on state statutes are doubtless aware that literally millions of senior citizens, poor Black and Hispanic Americans, students, and others do not currently possess voter identification credentials to satisfy these new requirements and will likely be denied the right to vote, a right that we treasure in our democracy. There has been much controversy over the passing of these laws, and activist groups are claiming that the passing of the new voter ID laws deprives many Americans of their constitutional right to vote. In certain states, opponents are asking for the voter ID laws to be postponed until after the November 6 presidential election because many citizens will not have the ability to acquire the necessary ID in time to vote. Opponents claim voter ID laws discriminate against the elderly, disabled, and minorities because they are a higher percentage of those who lack photo identification and do not have the ability to acquire said documentation. Since Republican legislators are largely responsible for the passing of these laws, certain Democrats and others have questioned the motives behind these new voting constraints. They argue that these laws were strategically passed in swing states in order to give the Republican Party an advantage in the November election, because many people in these states, said to be mostly supporters of the Obama campaign, do not have the proper documentation to apply for a photo ID. To underscore this contention, the Financial Times reported on August 6, 2012, that Mike Terze, the Republican leader of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, confirmed the purpose of the recent Pennsylvania ID law when he openly uttered, quote, voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done, end quote, in a speech to fellow House members. In Pennsylvania, there are more than 8,750,000 registered voters. Pennsylvania department officials estimate that 9.2%, that's 805,000 of the state's registered voters, do not have the required government-issued photo ID to vote in the November election. In 2008, President Obama won Pennsylvania by approximately 600,000 votes. If one assumes that blacks, Hispanics, senior citizens, and students generally make up the 9.2% of those excluded from voting, this fact, in conjunction with Representative Terze's statement that Governor Romney will win Pennsylvania, makes clear the intent of Pennsylvania's voter ID law. Nevertheless, some Republicans and others are claiming that they want to protect elections from voter fraud and keep the right to vote sacred. However, in-person voter fraud is virtually non-existent. A recent Carnegie Knight investigative reporting project found only 10 cases nationwide of in-person voting fraud in the last 2 years. Similar claims were made by Southern Democrats who opposed Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights activists marching in Alabama in support of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Selma to Montgomery March became known as Bloody Sunday when civil rights marchers attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge were met by Alabama state troopers. These marchers were beaten with billy clubs, bitten by snarling dogs, and trampled by mounted troopers. While new voter ID laws remain a hotly contested issue, a few states have come up with another way to acquire an identification card for those lacking the documents needed to obtain a state-issued photo ID. The Pennsylvania and Georgia Departments of Transportation will be giving out the free Department of State voter cards to registered voters. These cards will be valid for 10 years and can only be used for voting purposes. The applicant will need to provide their birth date, social security number, and 2 items that show proof of residency, such as a utility bill or credit card bill. The Department of Transportation will then contact the Department of State to confirm the voter registration status, and the applicant will leave the facility with their voter card in hand. The creation of the Department of State voter card in Pennsylvania, which will be made available at the end of August to anyone eligible to vote but unable to meet the requirements for the necessary forms of ID, will allow many more people to vote in the upcoming election, including those who thought that they had lost their constitutional right to vote. Unfortunately, not everyone has access to or pays attention to notification meant to inform the public. So even if they do have the necessary credentials, many of them may not be aware of their new voting obligations and may show up to the polls without an accepted ID. The Elected Face team urges you to share this video with your circle of friends in an effort to inform as many citizens as possible of their voting rights under the new voter ID laws and how it could affect them. If you know of anyone who cannot obtain a photo ID and is worried that they will be unable to vote, make it your duty to inform them that they can acquire a state voter card, because everyone should have the right to vote.